We are back with Season 2 of Business Logic. I'm your host, Andy Chin.
I think at the end of the day, it is actually more empowering because within your area, you are very much accountable for the quality and the product there. But there is someone kind of looking out for you when it comes to filling in the gaps between products and the seams.
My guest this March of 2020 is Michelle Bu, Payments Product Tech Lead at Stripe. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that at Stripe, Michelle is a living legend. She joined in 2013 as a new grad and is now one of the most tenured and respected engineers at the company. People know about the Collison brothers, but much fewer have heard of Michelle. My lived experience of 3 years of working at Stripe is that she's been a major factor behind why developers love Stripe. She's personally shipped major swaths of product and prevented bad releases that thankfully never made it out the door. She's also a personal hero of mine and someone I'm proud to call a friend. In this episode, you'll learn how she thinks about building world-class developer products, why product engineering is an important discipline, and why you should try to think like a product engineer, and the best types of sunscreen in the market. Yes, sunscreen is very important. Anyway, it's time for you to hear from Michelle herself. So here is my chat with Michelle Bu. Michelle, welcome to Business Logic.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you for being on the show. This has been a long time coming. How long have we known each other?
Probably since college, right?
Well, I would remember more than you, but when do you think we met?
When do I think we met? Probably at a hackathon at Berkeley back in the day. I don't know if you came to many of those, but that's probably where we first met.
Close, Michelle, but not quite.
Really?
Yeah, I went to Intro to JavaScript circa 2013.
Oh, wow.
I believe that was Intro to JavaScript, by the way, was a session that Michelle taught.
Yeah.
It's like an hour long.
Yeah, that was my last year at Berkeley, and I guess I did a few of them.
Yeah, and like in that hour, you tried to cover a lot of the basics of JavaScript for total beginners, like myself at the time. And what happened? What did I see? I was like, just trying to meet people at the time. I was like a freshman, so after the session, I went up and I was like, oh, hey, my name's Andy. Really, really great session. Hope we get to work together sometime. Maybe at a company called Stripe. And that's how much foresight I had at the time. Do you remember that?
I don't remember that. I'm so sorry.
I remember it so clearly. Okay.
Did you actually say Stripe?
No, I didn't.
No. Okay.
No. Thank you for being on the show. I'm really excited to have you. I know a lot about the contributions that you've made to Stripe, where both you and I work. But I want to give listeners a better sense for what you've worked on. I want people to kind of understand the magnitude of your contributions. And so maybe we could talk through the highlight reel. And we can go reverse chronologically, however you want.
Sure. Go reverse. So the most recent thing I worked on was I built the new payments APIs at Stripe. Before that, I worked on Stripe Elements. Before that, I worked on the first version of Stripe Radar. Before that, I worked on the Stripe dashboard. And way before that, I kind of worked on a little bit of everything because back then we were 50 people total when I first joined. And around the time that I started, we were 3 product engineers. And so product meant everything from dashboard to API to building the jobs page on stripe.com. And so we did all of that. So I've been all around the stack and the product.
And among those projects you mentioned, which by the way, I think we really should zoom in on these because you really just breeze through them. So you said the payments API itself in the very beginning.
Yeah, the new version of it. This is the most recent thing that I worked on.
Mm-hmm. This, by the way, is kind of the change from Stripe being a cards only, like designed for the US and Canada user to being...
Yeah. Basically, since we started, we had V1 charges, which we all know and love. And that was built when we first launched back in 2011. And it was really built for a time when we only really supported US credit cards. And so there are a lot of assumptions that we made back then that were really, really good and really made the API simple to use. But we found that as we began supporting more countries and more payment methods, those assumptions kind of fall apart because payments don't work the same way in every country.
Yeah. So it sounds like as Stripe goes global, basically a ton of stuff has to be rewritten.
Yeah. A ton of things have to change. And what's really exciting about that is, first of all, we are reaching out to more people across the entire world, but also we still have to be able to keep the API simple. And I think one thing that we are at risk of losing is just the simplicity of our APIs as we try to build something that is able to serve everyone globally.
Absolutely.
So that's a really, really exciting challenge to work on.
And that's something I absolutely want to continue talking about in the future. That is how you become more powerful, but still retain that simplicity. We will have plenty of time to go over that. Before that, I want to go even further, though, on Michelle, the person. Why don't we zoom back out, or like go back in time, rather, from the pre-Stripe Michelle, starting from where you grew up?
Yeah. So I grew up all over. My parents moved all across the US when I was growing up. I have been in the East Bay for 9 years now, so I consider that very much my home. I live in Oakland now, and I really love it.
Maybe set the setting for me here.
Sure.
At what age and when and where did you learn how to code? And when did you sort of realize that being an engineer was the right path?
Yeah. So I took my first coding class in 2011 at Berkeley. But thinking back more, I think I actually started coding way before then. In fourth grade, I started playing Neopets, which is
nice.
Yeah, which is a a very common introduction to programming and to like hacking around. And
do you remember the species of your pets?
Oh man, I remember I had a koi that I really, really liked. I don't know how to pronounce any of those words.
Right.
But one thing that I really liked on Neopets was I liked making user profiles for people. Mm-hmm. So I liked designing and coding up these profiles. And a lot of it was really fun because it was like pushing the edges of what Neopets, the framework, allowed you to do. So you would create all these image maps and then figure out how to put links as images. And there are all these cool things that you could do. And that was actually really, really fun for me. And I think looking back, that was what really got me excited about the internet, about computers.
Was there anything competing at the time where you're like, this engineering / HTML, CSS on Neopets is kind of cool, but really I should be a blank?
My parents are both doctors, so they always wanted me to be a doctor growing up, and that was kind of the default path. And so when I was applying to colleges, Berkeley was the only one where I'd applied for this degree called EECS, which was Electrical Engineering Computer Science. And after visiting Berkeley, I just really loved the campus. It's so beautiful. You went to Berkeley.
Go ahead.
It's so beautiful. There's mountains. The weather's perfect. And so I just had to come here. And luckily, Berkeley is in the center of everything going on in Silicon Valley. All the startups come to recruit at Berkeley. And that's actually where I first heard about Stripe. There was a startup career fair. And at the time, Stripe was, I think, 20 or 30 people. And they came to recruit at Berkeley. And I just really loved meeting the people.
I actually don't know the story. So your very first impression of Stripe was them behind a booth somewhere in a gymnasium at Berkeley.
I don't think that was my first impression because Stripe was already pretty popular in Hacker News. But I do think being at Berkeley meant that I was exposed to things like that, like Hacker News, like all these startups recruiting. Like I don't think I would even know how to get a job at a startup if I didn't go to school so close.
Do you happen to remember what on Hacker News, maybe like a few early blog posts they put out that were like, wow, very clever?
I think it was probably Capture the Flag.
Okay.
That was probably my first impression. And Stripe had held some hackathons back then. Mm-hmm. And I also just really loved the jobs page back then.
Nice.
Yeah. I don't know if you remember this. It like had everyone's photos on it. And if you hovered over them, they would show like a little stuffed animal.
Oh yeah. It was very personal.
It was very personal.
Like you literally see the whole company on one page.
But I was really interested in working on developer tools. And that's why I was interested in Stripe. One of the highlights of my time in college was working on this open source library called Pure.js. And it was basically a wrapper over WebRTC, which was a pretty new technology at that point. And just building this developer tool just made me really, really happy. All the users were very friendly. They were very thankful that the library existed. There was one moment where I realized that NTT, which is a big Japanese company, used Pure.js for one of their experiments that they were running. Yeah, and that was wild to me as someone in college building this library that some big company all the way across the world was using. And I really liked that feeling of just building for developers. And that's why I ended up joining Stripe.
I mean, how does one just wake up one morning and think to themselves, you know what the world needs? A WebRTC wrapper. That kind of come from nowhere. How did that interest come about?
That's an interesting question. I was just really intrigued by open source back then. There were all these cool libraries. There was Socket.io. The Node community back then was super open to beginners. And that was what I used for all my hackathons. Oh, maybe that was it. Maybe it was all the hackathons that I went to in college. And that was the best way of learning. And there were so many tools and open source libraries that made things just so easy for me, someone who'd never formally coded before, to create really, really cool things. And I think I went to maybe 3 or 4 hackathons a semester when I was in college. And each time I would learn something completely new. And it always felt really amazing. And that's not something I, in high school or even before that, could have ever imagined being able to do. And I think a lot of it was thanks to these libraries and all these tools that made it super easy for me to get started.
So one day you thought that you ought to make your own such tool?
Yeah, I wanted to make my own such tool. At the time, this was back in 2012, real time was all the rage. Build a real-time chat app in 10 lines of code was the thing back then. And there were a lot of real-time libraries coming out, and WebRTC was relatively new, and no one was really building things for peer-to-peer communication back then. So I thought that was potentially an area where I could be helpful to other people by digging really, really deep into all of the cross-browser issues you can encounter with WebRTC, abstracting over all of the rough edges of the Mozilla Firefox implementation and the Chrome implementation. And so I did that work so that nobody else would have to do that work. And I really like that feeling. I think it's the same at Stripe. We do the hard work of understanding deeply everything about payments so that nobody else has to.
I've got to hand it to you. You certainly have a lot more courage, or had a lot more courage than I did when I was learning. I thought hackathons were a pretty intimidating environment. You go in there, you got these people intensely, tapping away behind the laptops. They know exactly what they're doing, or at least they seem that way. And if you're a beginner, at least what I thought at the time, I was like, wow, I am outclassed. I should just pack up my laptop and go home. So, I mean, how did you not have that reaction?
That's interesting. I never really felt pressure to build something that actually worked. I just really, really like tinkering. And sometimes, especially freshman year, the hackathons I went to, I would end up with nothing. And I would still learn a lot from it. And that would be the joy of doing it. And I ended up, I think, having a good group of friends in school that were very supportive and were also very open to learning. And they never made me feel like I was dumb or feel like I didn't know enough to participate. So I think it was very fortunate.
I love also, by the way, that if any listener, even right now, goes to michelleboo.com, they'll find a blog. And that blog will have one post, last I checked. And this one post is about writing 21 nested callbacks. And I noticed this is a kind of a theme in your online presence, which is to sort of poke fun at yourself about coding. You'll have this series of tweets if you follow Michelle at...
I'm Hazel Koff.
At Hazel Koff. You'll find that there's a series. You're X into coding. It'd be ye're 5 into coding. Just learned how to replace...
Had to Google how to find random number between 2 numbers again.
Yeah, exactly. Why do that?
It's funny you talk about my online presence. My coworker, Adam, actually tweeted about me saying that I'm basically unknown on the internet, which is relatively true. I have 1 blog post and a couple of tweets ever. I think, honestly, the first blog post I wrote, the one about the 21 nested callbacks, that was because I really, really, really wanted others to feel like they could code as well. And I think at that point, I had just turned 21. I was 1 year out of school, and I felt like I was doing pretty good at my job. I was working at Stripe. I was building real things, and I had a CS degree. And I looked back to 2011 when I wrote the 21 nested callbacks, and I realized I'd come really, really far. And a lot of it was because I had a good community around me, and I was encouraged to ask questions, and I learned how to Google really early on. And I never felt any shame for writing bad code. And that's just how you learn. So I wanted to share that because I felt like I had, somewhat, not even close to being like a good engineer, but I had a job and I was working full time. And I just wanted to share that when I first learned how to code, I was really not there at all, but it's all about learning and the process of getting there. I think my Twitter presence is a different story, which is I'm actually kind of scared of Twitter. I feel like I don't have enough strong opinions to tweet about them. So the only things I really tweet about are things about myself, things about things I've learned, funny anecdotes about how I'm 7 years out of school now and I still have to Google very basic things. And really, that's not what's important in a lot of what I do day to day.
What would you say is, now that we're on that topic of like things that are important day to day, what actually matters besides, having the syntax of JavaScript memorized?
Yeah, I would say it's constantly being open to learning, listening a lot. Actually, I think the thing that I do most is just listen to people. And that's really how you end up scaling yourself as a company grows or as a product grows or as like the world changes around you.
What are you listening for?
That's a good question. I think now that Stripe is over 3,000 people.
3,000, really?
Is it 3,000?
I would have guessed 2,500 as of this recording, but we can fact check that later.
We can fact check that. I think now that Stripe is really big, a lot of it is just listening to how people feel about their work. I think for me, in my past, the highlights I know we went through the highlights earlier, but for me, the highlights haven't been the concrete projects that I work on, and more just the people that I work with. And obviously working on something impactful is really, really rewarding. But I think in my memory, the highlights are always when I had like a really good team and everyone worked really well together and supported each other. So there was a project very early on in my career, maybe like half a year out of school. It was a rewrite of the entire Stripe dashboard. And this was back in 2014. And I was just 1 year out of school and I was leading this project. And a year and a half later, we stopped the project. And that was a year and a half of me feeling like I didn't really make that much concrete impact in terms of the product. We never shipped that rewrite. We did a whole redesign of the dashboard, but it never really saw the light of day. But I had a lot of good memories from that time just because the people that I work with were so amazing and I learned so much from them. And most of them are actually still at Stripe today. And I hope that even though that project technically failed, like you could call it a failure, all of us just learned a lot from each other. And I hope that they have good memories of that time too. And so when I say listening, I think one thing that's important to me, and I think to a healthy company, is that everyone feels energized coming into work every day. And so I'm just listening for signs of that not being the case. And that's something that's really, really important to me, is that people feel energized to go to work every day and to be around the people that they're with.
Absolutely. I mean, that's really the most important thing, isn't it? When you get up and there's the inevitable like morning dread to do anything at that hour, something's gotta be the spark. And in the best case, it's the people that you're about to go see and work with.
Yeah. And that's how you build amazing things. Like I really, really enjoyed building Stripe Elements. That project probably took 3 months to rewrite Stripe.js and launch Elements. And I was working with a really, really good team and we got along really well. And we both delivered great impact and the people were amazing. And that's the like ideal setup for me. And so I want to make sure everyone has that environment as they're coming into work every day and doing really good work.
So something I've got to dig in on is that story you just told, not about Stripe Elements, but about this dashboard rewrite.
Yeah.
There's a lot of instances of why going on in my head. Like, why have a rewrite in the first place? Why did it fail? These are the things I feel like we don't talk enough about.
Yeah, definitely. So your first question, why do a rewrite in the first place? I think everyone's very familiar with that old blue Stripe login page, the one that looks kind of iOS 6 skeuomorphic. I think we only recently got rid of that. But back then, our entire dashboard looked like that. So this was late 2013. We decided to do a rewrite because our entire dashboard code base was in Backbone, and it was built pretty quickly, which was really good at the time. Like, obviously, we launched really, really quickly, and there were a lot of good things about the dashboard. But nobody really knew how to work in it anymore. The folks who had built the dashboard were no longer at Stripe at that point, and there weren't that many tests. And so we were just finding lots of bugs, and we were finding that we were spending a lot of our time fixing bugs and just doing maintenance on the dashboard, and it was really slowing us down. And it wasn't just Backbone, it was kind of like our own custom version of Backbone. And so it was hard to find documentation about how exactly to develop in that code base. And at the time, I think there were a couple of competing front-end frameworks that were all rising. There was Ember, Angular, and React. React was very, very new back then, but Angular and Ember were both pretty established, and we decided to go with Ember. So we use Ruby at Stripe, and Ember and Ruby are pretty closely coupled. And I think one of the reasons it didn't go so well was because we attempted to do a redesign at the same time as a rewrite. And so this made it really tricky for the engineers to feel like they were always building the right thing. Because when you're doing a redesign, you want to do UX research. You want to actually user test some of the UIs that you're introducing. But you're also doing like an entire re-architecture at the same time. And for a re-architecture, you want to just get things out as soon as possible and start migrating as soon as possible. So those two things kind of conflicted. Like on the UI side, we wanted to spend more time actually testing that the new UIs we were building were good. But on the engineering side, like we also needed to move quickly so we didn't have two stacks forever. And so because we were trying to do both the re-architecture and the redesign at the same time, I think it just caused the project to drag for a really long time. That's not to say we didn't get much out of it. We built a component library. It was called Bootstripe, and we ended up using that in the old dashboard once we killed the dashboard rewrite project. We also built some developer tools that we then recycled for the existing dashboard as well. And then I believe it was 2015 when we stopped the project, we started a React rewrite. And that was a more incremental rewrite.
I see.
React was more established at that point, and there were just more precedent for doing like an incremental rewrite of a code base in React. And that time we also did not try to do a redesign with it. So you see that over time, like the Stripe dashboard has kind of slowly evolved in its design language. But yeah, back in 2014, we did try to change it all at once. It was a really cool purple design. It's quite good.
Wow. If we go back to the Backbone to Ember rewrite attempt, which didn't work out, to try not to be too swayed here by hindsight bias, but on paper, it wasn't short for ambition.
No, not at all.
Right?
Not at all.
I mean, like this vision of the future where you don't get these, hard to reproduce dashboard bugs, modern framework that everyone loves to develop in.
Yeah.
It's an exciting project. You can't really fault yourself for being excited about something like that. But I'm sure at some part of it, you had to have known that there was some chance it could fail.
Yeah.
And how did you sort of reason with that?
I think when we started the project, we knew there was some risk that it would fail. Maybe a year in, so when we started the project, it was me and one other engineer. And about a year in, we had 8 whole engineers working on that project. So that means there were some engineers who were like hired to Stripe just to work on that project. And that was all they had seen of Stripe at that point. I think there was huge risk at that point of like sunk cost fallacy. Oh, we've already, spun up all these engineers on the new stack. We've already spent a year and some change working on this rewrite. Why don't we power through? And I'm glad we didn't. I think as the person leading the project, there were some days when I felt like it wasn't necessarily the right thing to do. And I think in retrospect, we should have been constantly reevaluating that project because we knew it was risky. We should have checked in maybe even monthly and said, is this still going in the right trajectory? Should we maybe reconsider? We definitely didn't do that back then. And I was a year out of school leading a project like this. I definitely didn't really know what to even expect. I didn't actually know how risky a rewrite project was. I'd never been a part of one before. And when the news came that the project was getting shut down, I was obviously disappointed. But maybe a week or two later, I realized it was the right thing to do. It was clearly weighing on all of us that this project had gone on for so long, and we weren't sure when it was going to end and when it was going to see the light of day. So I did feel some sense of relief, actually, when it ended. And that's when I knew it was the right decision, even though it was painful and there was a lot of work that would be essentially thrown away. It still felt good. And I think it felt much better than if the project were to continue.
Now I've got to dig in on something you were getting at there, which is kind of tactics to lead a large, risky project. I mean, even though the first dashboard rewrite attempt did not achieve what you set out to do, you since led a lot of dramatic, risky projects to completion, to success. We can go to stripe.com/docs right now and see the fruit of all that hard work. You tell your former self, how would you advise your former self how one can de-risk such large projects?
I think it definitely depends on the project. I have been a part of a lot of risky projects since then. I think the key is probably incrementalism and just having a plan that allows you to iterate quickly and take small chunks of work and have them ship sooner rather than later. The other rewrite that I was a part of after the dashboard was the Stripe.js rewrite. So that was another wholesale rewrite from one code base to a totally different code base.
And what does Stripe.js do?
Yeah, so Stripe.js is essentially the JavaScript SDK for Stripe. It is the JavaScript library that everyone who integrates with the default integration for Stripe uses on their website to load elements, to load checkout, all of our front-end UI components. So Stripe.js was another example of this wholesale rewrite. And for that one, it was much more scoped. We decided that the first goal there was to just replace cards, like credit card collection form. And at the time, the old version of Stripe.js had all these other features like Apple Pay and Bitcoin. A lot of things were in there. But we took it one step at a time. We said, we'll do cards first. Then we will change the documents for cards, and then we will continue until we hit everything, and then do a full launch then. So I think doing it incrementally definitely helped us there.
Incrementalism and big, risky projects, at first glance, it seems like those are opposing ideas or conflicting ideas. But here, I guess you present a view of the world where you can kind of achieve one through the other. No matter how audacious the end goal is, you can always kind of figure out a way to break it up into digestible parts such that you get there in a kind of well-iterated way.
Yeah, I think it is important, to your point, though, to know where you're going. So the other example of a big rewrite was the new payments APIs, where we had sources and charges, which were our two main APIs from back in 2011. And we introduced the new payment methods and payment intents APIs. And that had to be incremental. We had to first support a couple of payment methods on it and a couple of flows on it, and then slowly migrate people over. And that was a really painful process because for our users, they want to do payments integration once and have it always work for them. So telling them that they suddenly needed to migrate to a different API, we had to be very thoughtful about that. That said, we did, before we started this project, actually spend months figuring out what the final vision was. And so we did like 3 hours of whiteboarding a day where we would draw out all of the new APIs we wanted to introduce. We would run through all of these test cases in our heads and on the whiteboard. And obviously we didn't come up with a final solution in that room, but we did pretty rigorously test what we thought our final vision would be. And then the process of actually building it then was more incremental. So we first shipped the new payments APIs for cards, and we're actually slowly still adding more payment methods to it now and migrating things over. It's been actually a 2-year endeavor now. Definitely some painful points in between where our documentation was split between 2 different worlds. And if you're a Stripe user, you'll see that our docs have changed quite a bit over the last couple of months. And they're all good improvements and will continue evolving. I think one thing that we learned through this process was that all of our products are so closely coupled. Someone coming in and using Stripe is using the dashboard, the docs, the API as one unit. Even if internally we see it as 5 different teams building different products to our users, that's all just Stripe. And it's so important for them to be cohesive. And so that makes these big projects even more challenging because you have to make sure the rest of the ecosystem continues moving as you're making changes.
That's great, because I really want to ask you about this point about Stripe growing. I mean, Stripe's no longer 50 people. As you said, something on the order of 2,500 to 3,000 people. So you being not just a great product engineer yourself, but sort of an author of how product engineering should work at Stripe, what's your sense for how product development has changed as Stripe grows?
Yeah, so there's some ways where it has changed and some ways where it hasn't. Even when I first joined, we had something like an API review board where for every API change we make, we have to get everyone to essentially agree on it. Back then, of course, it was very easy. There were only a couple of us working on the API, so we just kind of agreed between each other about these changes. Now that we have many, many, many product teams all working on the API, we have a centralized API review board, and these folks know how to keep the API consistent. They know everything that's going on in terms of API development, so they can connect the dots if teams are not synced with each other. So that's one process that's kind of stayed the same over time, but just had to scale out a bit. There's also things that we've had to introduce over time. So to the point of people see Stripe as just one product. We have something called implementation review. When a new feature is about to launch, we actually have someone review it from a holistic perspective. So from an end-to-end perspective, not just reviewing that one flow or that one feature, but coming in almost pretending like they're a user with fresh eyes and seeing if they understand it in context of everything else. Because it's very easy to make one workflow make sense within itself. But when you consider that one flow within the context of the broader product, it's easy for it to feel a little bit disjoint or to feel like it doesn't quite connect with other parts of the product. So that's been a pretty important part of scaling the product and maintaining product quality. Another thing we have started to do is during onboarding, so when a new Stripe joins, we'll actually have them dog food the API. And that's actually really important because as someone building a product for developers, we're sometimes the best signal of what direction the product is going. And so during dog fooding, I see like really, really good Stripe developers sometimes getting lost in our docs. And that's actually a really good signal to us that something needs to change or evolve. So it's not only just a good exercise for them to figure out how to dog food and how our products work, but also a great exercise for the people watching them to see what needs to change.
Mm-hmm. Let me play just a bit of devil's advocate here.
Yeah.
It so happens that Stripe is netted out on this state where you have review boards in a sense, an API review, implementation review of trusted, probably tenured, maybe a good mix of tenure, but some group of people whose job it is to ensure product quality and ensure that people have a great integration experience with Stripe. That's how we happen to have netted out. But I wonder if there's an alternative world where we instead tell teams that they are responsible for their own integration experience and implementation reviewing, and it's more decentralized. Like, how did we end up with kind of more centralized power in this way? And what trade-offs, I guess, did we consider in that structure?
Yeah, so I think teams are responsible for their own integration experience. These centralized review forms are really just filling in the seams between the products. So you work in payments. The folks working in payments definitely do own every single piece of the payments experience end to end. But the point where the review boards come in is, well, how does the payments API interact with our issuing API? Or how does this payments API feel when you consider it in the context of Connect, for example? It may at first glance feel like it's disempowering to folks working in individual areas. I think at the end of the day, it is actually more empowering because within your area, you are very much accountable for the quality and the product there. But there is someone kind of looking out for you when it comes to filling in the gaps between products and the seams.
I appreciate that level of thoughtfulness. If I was to think about my own question a second ago about how the product development process has changed, one thing that might jump out to mind is this idea of product metrics. I have to imagine that when you joined Stripe, nobody was looking at the brand new payments API and saying, we need 100 requests per minute or else this project is a failure. It was probably much broader, like, does it even work? Or will people even adopt it? And so my question to you is, now that product metrics, at least at Stripe and probably in other product organizations, have become so in vogue, I guess, broadly speaking, what place should they have? And when does it make sense not to have them?
I think it always makes sense to have metrics. Even when I first joined, we had like error rates. Error rates should not go up. We did get paged. We did have operational metrics. We did have things we were looking at weekly. I do think metrics can often be a very blunt tool. My personal opinion is that they're really, really important for looking at larger trends and for making sure that changes that you make are not regressing some metric that you really, really care about. And sometimes we can do that accidentally, especially as a global API, right? You might accidentally make a change that's really great for US users, but actually really bad for EU users. And so it's good to kind of see those trends at a very macro level. I do think, though, that metrics, to be useful, they have to be coupled with a mental model that you're building of the world. You should be able to explain the metric. If there's something going up or going down, you should have some model in your head of why that's the case, and you should be using that metric to build that model. So just a random example off the top of my head is sending emails. If you send emails to people right after they sign up, it tends to get them to come back to your site. And that does not speak to the quality of the email you're sending. It doesn't speak to whether or not there's some users who are super annoyed by those emails and actually like hate receiving them. It just kind of makes that metric go up. So that's where we have to be careful, I think. We have to be thinking, well, why is this metric going up? Is it actually important to what I'm really trying to accomplish here, which is getting developers to love Stripe and come back and complete their integration? Or is it just a metric that doesn't actually matter to me? And so the metrics that I found most useful are the ones where they give me some macro view of what's going on. I have a mental model that I'm building as I'm seeing that metric go up or down. And they're always coupled with some sort of actual user feedback, qualitative feedback, whether it's dog fooding or seeing the reactions of your users, or just, watching Twitter and Hacker News and seeing how people generally feel about the product and about the APIs. So even if there's, 100 requests per second on the new payments APIs, that doesn't mean people like them. That doesn't mean people are delighted by them. And that's the kind of signal that you can only get by actually talking to the users and actually monitoring things like Twitter and Hacker News.
What does it mean to be a product engineer to you?
I think product engineer to me is anyone who is responsible for serving a user. And this is a very weakly held model of a product engineer for me. But I think when we say product engineer, sometimes we think of folks who work on UI or things that are clearly visible to users. Mm-hmm. I think when it comes to APIs and infrastructure, you're also a product engineer because you are delivering a interface to some other developers. So even if you're on an infrastructure team, unless you're just working on like deep optimizations in the database, mm-hmm. you're probably serving a user. And so in my mind, you're probably a product engineer. You probably need to know how to think like your users. You probably need to know what problems you're solving, what jobs you need to get done, how your users are reacting to the thing that you're delivering. And so I think the big difference in product engineers as we generally think of them, and product engineers in my mind, is that in my mind, like there's a wider range of people who are product engineers who need to be thinking about their users every day.
I ask this because you are doing a lot of work internally to legitimize this as a discipline, product engineering. As you said, not so much as a job description, because it's a little too broad to be useful there.
Right.
You can be an infrastructure engineer and a product engineer, so long as you have a user in mind and you care about delighting them, it sounds like.
Yeah.
I really want to know, I guess, what motivates this, I guess, legitimize this. Like, why do you spend at least 5% of your time every week making this more of a thing?
I think it's because that's why I joined Stripe. I joined Stripe to work on interfaces. I joined Stripe to work on what is essentially infrastructure for developers. And I think it's not seen as a super exciting path to go down. I think people get excited about deep technical problems, and people get excited about building cool consumer apps and products and UIs. And those are all super exciting. But I think there's something that I'm personally excited about, which is building great APIs and interfaces. And we generally don't talk about that as product engineering. We kind of call it infrastructure engineering sometimes. Sometimes I'm not sure what we call it generally, actually. Maybe API engineering. But I personally find that sort of problem really, really exciting, because you are essentially doing modeling. You're modeling your user's view of the world, and you're coming up with abstractions, and you're taking a lot of time to deeply understand the flow, how your users write their applications. And that to me is a really, really fun problem. And I think it's underrated. And it's also where I think there's a lot of talk about like Stripe and PMs. And I think API engineering is where engineers can wear the PM hat most effectively, because we're clearly our own users. We clearly know how we tend to make API calls or how we would architect an application. And so it's really, really valuable for engineers to really step up to this role of product engineer when it comes to designing APIs and interfaces.
Let's talk about this a bit more. This developing for developers, being essentially your own user. What makes the developer such a unique user to build for, besides, what you just mentioned, this phenomenon that you kind of have this good intuitive product sense? What have you learned, I guess, about building developer products from all these years?
Yeah, developers are a really interesting set of users to build for. They contain multitudes. They are very intelligent, but also very, very lazy. And that's probably why most of us became developers in the first place, because we didn't want to do something, so we scripted it away. Yeah. And myself as a developer, I'm also very, very lazy. Like, I prefer to Google something and copy and paste a snippet off of Stack Overflow than to read, a book. And that's, I think, the most fun part about building for developers, is inheriting this mindset of, I'm extremely smart, but I'm also very lazy. How do I make the simplest possible product that's also very, very powerful and very customizable? And I think sometimes people build products that are very, very simple, but then once you get to a certain point, they're not customizable enough, or they don't have enough power. Other times you get products that are super powerful and customizable, but they have a super high ramp to actually being able to take advantage of it. Like Vim is a classic example where very powerful. I love Vim. I'm a huge Vim user myself, but when you first enter it, you can't even figure out how to escape.
Yeah.
Yep.
After this, you're going to have to help me escape Vim. I'm stuck on it on my computer.
For years, right?
For years. Still locked in there.
Yeah. And there are a lot of products like that. And a lot of them I love. Like Anki is another example. It's a space repetition system. Very, very powerful. You can do basically anything with the system, but huge ramp to actually understand how to use it effectively. And so building for developers, you get this great challenge of needing to build something really powerful, but also trying to keep it simple. And I just like living in that balance.
Do you have maybe a short list of developer tools that you personally really keep coming back to as like, this is excellent developer experience? You can't say Stripe. that's not fair. But just things that really get it right and why.
What do you mean by developer tool?
I don't know, something that you use on the day-to-day to do your job maybe. Let's start with that, I guess. A tool that you use to build software yourself.
Sure. When I'm building my own side projects for dog fooding Stripe, I always jump to the ones that are the easiest to get started with. So this might not actually live up to my previously stated principles of also being powerful, because I've never had that problem where I start off easy and I need to get more power from it. I do love Semantic UI. It's a UI library, and it's just very, very easy to get started. You don't have to mess with grids. You don't have to mess with like numbers at all. You just kind of compose components, and it just magically looks reasonable on your website. And that to me is like a great, simple product to get started with. Chrome DevTools is another one that I depend on, and I'm sure lots of developers depend on daily. I also really love Create React App. That's an interesting one where the initial getting started is super easy, and then you eject, and then it just dumps everything on you at once. So maybe something there that they could be doing better. But that's another one that I use pretty regularly. I think the first developer tool that I really loved was MDN, just the documentation. That to me was, I'd previously read technical documentation that was inaccessible. Like I felt like it was using too much jargon, or I just felt kind of dumb reading it. But I don't know if you've read MDN recently.
Mozilla Developer Network?
Yes. They're docs.
Yes.
So you can look up like string slice on or array slice on MDN. And they just use very plain language. They tell you exactly what the parameters are. They tell you exactly what the types are. And it's not very intimidating at all. And I think that was one of the resources that first made me feel like I could do this.
Simplicity versus power.
Yeah.
2 words you've said.
Yeah.
A couple times. Again, something that presents attention.
Yeah.
How have you learned how to build products that are simple, but also powerful?
I think you have to start with the powerful component of this. The product that you build, especially when it comes to APIs, has to be able to model the full complexity of the space that you want to expose to users. Once you have that, then you can take bits of it and package it up into simple entry points. So that's generally how I think about it. I know that's like overly abstract, but one concrete example is when we were building payment intents, we had designed it as a payment state machine that would be generic enough that any new payment method in the world, no matter how many steps it had, could be modeled by the state machine. And we ended up doing that. But when we started showing it to US users, we realized it was a bit too complicated for US users. US users generally, you don't use any payment method other than card and Apple Pay, which is card, under the hood. You don't really see super asynchronous payment methods. You don't see these payment methods like in Japan or in Mexico where they print out a voucher and they bring it to a convenience store and pay cash there. So there's just much less complexity when you're processing payments in the US. And so our US users didn't really understand why the APIs had to look like that at all. They didn't really care to learn about the complexity yet because they were only serving customers in the US. And so we found that once we had this very, very generic abstraction that can model a bunch of different things, we were able to come up with a packaging of it that was very, very simple for US users. So we added, an extra parameter that would error if the state machine became more complicated than what a synchronous US payment looks like, what people are familiar with for a synchronous US payment. And that was a way of packaging something that's actually really, really powerful and complicated under the hood into something that is appropriate for that type of user.
So far, we've talked about writing code ourselves and being the authors of the product ourselves as product engineers. But you mentioned something way earlier in this show about your favorite part of working at Stripe being other people. And since joining, you've mentored many people. I was wondering, just generally, what have you learned about mentoring people effectively from having done it so many times?
Mentorship is an interesting word. What does it mean to you?
It can mean a lot of things for sure. Sometimes it's
Yeah.
a assigned title. So you join the company and, oh, this is your mentor. They will help you be successful. Then maybe there's that's one end of the spectrum. The other is the more informal, someone who you just want to see succeed and you'll do whatever you can in your power to help them do that. And maybe it's done out of a motivation because you can think of someone in your own life who played that role for you, and it's about paying it forward. So I'll keep it very broad.
I see. Yeah, I think I've definitely onboarded a lot of people to Stripe. And I think mentorship, again, as you're saying, it's a very broad word. I find that it's most useful when there's a specific topic that you're looking to get more experience on or get more expertise on. And so when I'm the one who's been at Stripe for a while, when new people join, then that's the area that I'm mentoring them on, is like the Stripe specific context and code base and how to operate at Stripe and things like that. I have generally found the like formal, this person is your mentor kind of thing, not super useful for me personally, because I don't always know what to ask of them. And I think a mentorship relationship is only truly productive when the mentee knows what they're trying to get out of that particular relationship. So I've mostly found my own mentors over time, and they've always been because I wanted to learn something specific from a person. If this person is really good at API design, then I might talk with them about that topic. Or if I remember when I first joined Stripe, I never had a manager before. And there was a coworker of mine, Alex, who was a bit older than me, but he'd had managers before. And that was like the thing that I wanted mentorship on. I just wanted to know what to expect out of a manager. And I wanted to know what to expect out of like working a real job and working on a team. And so there were always something specific that I was trying to get. And that was where I found my best mentorship relationships. I think sponsorship, which I think you briefly touched on, which is finding opportunities for people that you're trying to help succeed. That one is really, really important to me. I've been really lucky to have a lot of sponsors to give me opportunities, to clue me in on really cool projects. And so that one to me is almost the more valuable one because you're not always aware of the opportunities that exist. And so as much as possible, I try to be a sponsor to people that I'm talking to. I try to flag opportunities to them. I try to connect people because that's what I've personally found most valuable for my career.
Yeah, once you said that, I realized just how much I coupled those ideas in my head. If I'm understanding you right, you're sort of saying that mentorship is more of a temporary role. It's kind of short-lived. You get mentored by someone to learn a very specific thing. Then, I mean, for lack of a better word, you discard, and then you move on to the next thing you want to learn. Whereas sponsorship is more of this sort of long-term, motivated by something, but it's really just, I want this person to succeed, sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. I would say that I have so many mentors. Like today, I probably have at least 5 mentors, and they're all on just different topics or areas that I'm trying to grow in. And you should be constantly looking for mentors and those mentorship relationships on areas that you want to develop in. And I think it's also totally fine to say, hey, I've been assigned to this one person as a mentor, but I'm just not getting anything out of it. And so we should stop meeting. Like your time is also very valuable. So I think there's definitely mentorship relationships where maybe what you're trying to learn right now just isn't aligned with what they're able to offer you. And so it's better to find someone where even if they can't mentor you on every single area you're looking for, they're really, really good at one area.
What are you looking to do in your next chapter in your career? Going to be intentionally broad, not necessarily even at Stripe, but just the future. What do you want to achieve?
I think I just want to keep learning and keep growing with the company. I want to make Stripe a great place for people to work. I want everyone to come into work with the same excitement that I do about the people that I get to work with. I'm of course excited about the vision of Stripe, which is, making payments accessible to everyone around the world, making starting a business really, really easy. And I know you're also excited about that as well. I also want to make product engineering as a discipline a lot more concrete. It's still very fuzzy in my head, but I really want to make things like API design and interface design really, really well known and well regarded as a discipline. I think it's one of my goals this year to just write more about it. I'll need to find the space to actually do that.
A new blog post coming to michelleboo.com?
Maybe.
Could it be? 8 years later.
Yeah, 8 years later. Yeah, I do want to just take more time to write and think about that. Because I do believe that developer tools are super high leverage to work on. And I've personally gotten so much enjoyment and I feel so impactful every time I work on a developer tool. So I want to make it known to everyone that that's a thing that you can work on.
You know what time it is?
What time is it?
It's time for the lightning round. This is where, of course, I ask lightning quick questions and you give me the most concise response you can manage. Sound good?
That sounds hard.
Well, we'll try.
All right.
You're a big fan of bread. What is the best type of bread in the whole world?
In the whole world, Acme torpedo roll.
Got
It's
it.
very specific.
Acme being
Acme,
the bakery.
the bakery, the Berkeley Bakery.
A bakery called Acme.
A bakery called Acme.
The generic company name
Yes.
is an actual instantiation of a bakery.
Yes, it is. It is the best bakery.
Just want to make sure. Favorite music to write code to? Could be a song, could be an artist, genre.
Interesting. I don't actually write code to music.
Not at all.
Not at all. No.
Silence.
To silence.
That is like as much silence as you can get in the office, which is not always true, but somehow you.
That's true. I like the
Check it
ambient
out.
noise.
Okay.
I like coding to ambient noise.
All right, ambient noise it is. I'll look that up on Spotify. The best brand of sunscreen. You're a big sunscreen advocate. What's the best sunscreen?
I am a big sunscreen advocate. It depends. Is it for your face or for your body?
Oh, geez. One of each.
I like the Neutrogena soft touch sunscreen. And for my face, I use a Korean brand called Misha.
Sounds like it's hard to get.
It's all right. You can get anything on Amazon.
Okay. It is on Amazon. Cool. Cool. I'll ask them to sponsor us. Lastly, finish this sentence. Go.
Dropbox.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. There you go. Go Dropbox. Okay. Thank you very much, Michelle. This was a fabulous interview. I really, really appreciate you taking the time. I learned a ton. This is an awesome episode. If folks who are listening want to learn more about you, where should they go?
You can find me on Twitter. I'm Hazel Koff, or I'm just Michelle at Stripe.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michelle. This is excellent.
Thank you, Andy.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to yet another episode of Business Logic. If you like the show, please rate the show on whatever app you happen to be using. Apple Podcasts is my personal favorite rating place. And don't forget to follow the show on Twitter if you have a Twitter. The handle of the account is @BusinessLogicFM. And, even better than that is to actually tell your friends how much you like the show if you do. This season is going to be really, really great. I am very, very excited about the roster of guests that I have lined up, and you'll soon see why. So see you in the next one. Cheers.